Well, welcome. I think you're in for a real treat having Peniel Joseph here. I have to tell you, I guess it's been 16 years since I learned about Peniel. I had just published my book on the Freedom Rides, and I think that's why the Washington Post book world sent me this book sort of out of the blue to ask me if I'd review it. It was called Waiting Till the Midnight Hour. What a title, huh? Like a rock song. But it was a narrative of Black power in America. And Peniel had just, I guess it was 6 years out of graduate school, weren't you? He went to Temple, got his PhD on Stony Brook as an undergraduate. And I have to say, I was really knocked out by that book. I'm a civil rights historian as well, but generally speaking, Black power has not been considered as part of that story until Peniel, really. He sort of invented Black power studies. So I gave that book, I think, as good a review as I could, anyway. I did my best. And,
no, it was amazing.
I take full credit for his career since then by that review, but since that time, he's been one of the most prolific scholars in the field of race and civil rights in the United States, for sure. He's become something of an academic rock star, I think I can say that. And he's taught at a number of universities, but he sort of settled at University of Texas at Austin for the last 8 years, where he has multiple titles. I won't give you all the titles because it would take half of our time, but he's an associate dean in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He has the Barbara Jordan Chair of Ethics and Political Values. He's a professor in the history department. He runs a center for, I guess, race and justice, is that right?
Race and democracy.
Race and democracy, sorry. And anyway, he among his books I recommend to you, in addition to the one we're going to talk about today, is The Sword and the Shield. I think they're selling it down. I think you can get it signed after this session. The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. That hasn't been done very often, trying to blend those two major figures in one book, to try to do justice to them both, and he does an absolutely marvelous job. He did a biography of Stokely Carmichael, one of my favorites, and he's done a number of books on the Black power and various aspects of that. But I have to say, this new book I have here, The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century, is really like nothing I've read before, I have to say. I'm really proud of you for doing this. Historians generally don't like to get too close to the present. We're more comfortable in the deep past, where no one can look over our shoulder, where most of the historical figures are dead. Right? They can't complain about what we say. But so it's really a brave figure like Peniel who is taking on contemporary history. And the other thing that he's doing, and I want to start with the first question about this, it's a work of history, and a quite remarkable one, but it's also a work of autobiography, I'd say, and sort of a memoir. Peniel is a very important part of the book about his life and experiences and how he came to write this book. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, to start, about your decision to do that. It's kind of revealing all this about yourself and your life and how you came to be who you are now.
Well, yeah, Ray, first of all, let me thank you for being the interlocutor here and for all the mentoring you've done and influence on my career. Your own work on the Freedom Rides is monumental, really the best book, the definitive history of the Freedom Rides. And the biography of Arthur Ashe is just sublime. I learned so much. So your work has always been a model. It's interesting hearing Charlene Hunter Galt, who I've known for years and I consider a friend and mentor, and so much of her life has been about stories and storytelling. And I think what I try to do in the Third Reconstruction is really, I break things down into stories. I believe that since 1865, the United States has been locked in two different competing stories. And one of those stories is a Reconstructionist story, supporters of multiracial democracy, supporters of intersectional justice, multiracial justice for all people. And that means people who are not just black, white, but Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, indigenous folks, queer folks, disabled, the whole range. And that story leads to certain consequences. So in a lot of ways, that story has really impacted my life, and I try to show that in this book. The other story is the redemptionist story, the story of the lost cause. And in order to understand MAGA, in order to understand Trump, the roots of our own partisan, racial, political divides, we've got to go back to at least the Civil War. And so in this book, I follow these three periods of Reconstruction. And I really put myself in it because I wanted to understand why and how the study of history really helped me and saved me. You know, I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965, born and raised in New York City. My mother, who's 83 years old, was a trade unionist. Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, 1199 SCIU. So I was on my first picket line in New York City in elementary school. And so that's how I grew up. And when you grow up in a sort of even though I grew up in segregated Jamaica, Queens, because of our connections with SCIU 1199, and my mother speaks 4 languages. She speaks French and Haitian and English and Spanish fluently. And so we had a lot of Spanish-speaking friends from all over the country, but we also had a lot of Jewish friends. We had a lot of folks who were from Europe and from Africa and the Caribbean. And so I learned about solidarity in that way. And really the story that bound us together was that Reconstructionist story. It was that story that, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about abolition democracy in his 1935 book, The Third Black Reconstruction. And so I wanted to get to the roots of that. So I talk about growing up in New York City and how history really saved me.
Yeah, it's really an amazing amalgam. So when you see the book about his own story and his broader stories, I wonder if it would be good for us or for you to actually talk specifically about this concept of the third Reconstruction. I suspect there are people in the audience who are proud of themselves that they remember that there was a Reconstruction, right? The first Reconstruction, let alone a second Reconstruction and a third Reconstruction, which is essentially a phrase that Peniel invented. Or is the first person really to bring it to prominence. So if you could talk about the third Reconstruction, what do you really mean by that?
Oh no, definitely. There's been people talking about third Reconstruction. Historians, Reverend William J. Barber, the Moral Mondays movement. I really think about the third Reconstruction as the period between 2008 to the present. And my 4 hinge points are the election of Barack Obama, the rise of BLM, Black Lives Matter, 1.0 in 2013 after the murder of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his murderer, the rise of MAGA and Donald J. Trump in 2016 and what that wrought on the country. And then finally 2020 and all the different juxtapositions. Because Ray, when we think about these periods of Reconstruction, they've been marked by both racial progress and backlash and the simultaneity of those processes. And I think that's what throws people off. People will say to me, where do you see hope? And why do you think about racial progress? And why are you optimistic in certain ways? Even as I'm very realistic and detailed about the histories we face, the challenges we face. It's really because all 3 periods of Reconstruction, in 2020, we see the racial disparities of the pandemic, but we also see 25 million people in the streets in the aftermath of George Floyd's murders of Breonna Taylor. We see the most racially divisive presidential election in American history, but we also see the most participatory Democratic election to the extent that more people vote in 2020 than in the history of the entire republic, right? At the same time, you see the shadow forming of the big lie, but the day before January 6th, we see Georgia elect the first Jewish and Black senators in that state's history, right? So it's really an amalgam, right? And even now we've seen, especially Florida, leading the attack on just free speech and American history with the CRT, the critical race theory hoax, right? And the efforts to curtail truth teaching in our history. But at the same time, we see Justice Jackson, first black woman on the Supreme Court. We see more young people participating in this midterm election, but also organizing for justice, right? So we see these cycles and patterns of both progress and backlash simultaneously that I argue are really rooted in that first period of Reconstruction.
I have to say here, my birthday is January 6th. Used to be known as the Epiphany and the 12th day of Christmas. Now it's Insurrection Day, so I took it personally, I have to say. Peniel, I thought one of the most fascinating parts of your book was how you dealt with Barack Obama. And you say, of course, his election in 2008 was a pinch point, but you also talk about the incredible pressures on him or his inability to break out of a certain mold to satisfy all of the hopes and dreams of the Black Lives Matter movement. I wonder if you could talk about that. I think you did a wonderful job in the book, but I think a lot of what you said is not generally known about sort of the pluses and minuses of having Obama as the first black president.
Certainly, I very much admire Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. I talk about both the thrill of hearing him speak for the first time in 2004. I happened to be in Boston when he spoke July 27, 2004 at the Democratic National Convention. I had an opportunity to meet him right before Iowa, and I was, enthralled. And I think that Obama, in certain ways, represents the best of America. And I also think that there are constraints. Obama gives us a vision of American exceptionalism that the country really wanted to hear and wanted to believe. And when we think about that vision of American exceptionalism, it is this idea that we are this imperfect union, but we are perfecting that union. Bad things have happened, like slavery, the dispossession of indigenous people, the Holocaust. So many different things have happened. Our marginalization of women. We've done so many different things, but we're going to get better, right? That's a very tantalizing story. So I think one of the reasons Obama won 2 elections and became this meteor, this superstar, was because he told this great story about American history. I juxtapose that with the movement for Black Lives, right? And they told us a different story, right? It was still part of the same narrative, but they were talking about why black people, young people, women and men were being killed and tortured by the police, why mass incarceration, why continual residential segregation. I'm somebody who asked that question as well, because I grew up in Jamaica, Queens, in an all-black neighborhood. But I went to St. Joachim and Ann, and they were telling us that the civil rights movement we had overcome, right? And so I used to ask my teachers, how come the only white people we're seeing are teachers at this school and on television, right? And they had no answer. They didn't tell me about white flight, and they didn't tell me why this was happening. I had to sort of learn that later, right? And so what's interesting about Obama is Obama really represents this exemplar of a kind of top-down citizenship that is both Reconstructionist, but also has a redemptionist drift baked in, right? And BLM represented this bottom-up, grassroots insistence on dignity, right? On black dignity. And what I write about in the Third Reconstruction, but I really build on some of the arguments I made in The Sword and the Shield, is that you need both. You need dignity and citizenship. And dignity is always the prerequisite for citizenship. So what I mean by dignity is this. We are all born with human dignity. And what citizenship is the external recognition of that dignity, right? But even as we're all born with human dignity, not everyone has that dignity acknowledged or validated, even by their parents or their caretakers. It might be because they're queer, it might be because of whatever situation they're in. So really claiming your dignity, especially for black people have always had a difficult time claiming that dignity in the United States because of antebellum slavery, because of racial slavery, right? And so Obama represents a certain kind of citizenship, but it's a citizenship where black people are forced to color within the lines, right? Your behavior has to be perfect for you to have access to innocence and dignity, right? You have to go to certain schools. You have to be viewed in a certain way. And what I think BLM challenged Obama, and I have a great story, December of 2014, Obama's in the White House meeting up with Black Lives Matter activists, 7 activists from Ferguson. And they're talking to him about what they're facing. And he's telling them that the United States is like a great big ocean liner. It's like a big tanker of a ship, and you can't just turn that ship on a dial. Change is incremental, right? And they tell him that they just finished facing tear gas and police violence in Ferguson, Missouri. And they're talking to the first black president about justice, and he's telling them that change takes time, right? And so I thought that was a remarkable scene, because when we think about the period of Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction, 1865 to 1898, if the country had gone through the process of multiracial democracy that was invested in the bloodshed of over 700,000 Americans, we would have had a Barack Obama way before 2008, right? The reason why it took so long for Obama is because even though the South loses the Civil War, it wins the narrative war after the Civil War, right? And that narrative war is the narrative war where the lost cause becomes the story of American democracy, right? Even though it's an authoritarian democracy, this whole rise of authoritarianism and anti-democracy that we're seeing in the United States right now, it's really rooted in our Confederate roots, right? You remember that book, Confederates in the Attic? That book? And The Lost Cause is a story that says Reconstruction and black citizenship and dignity is wrong. The Lost Cause is a story that justifies lynching and racial segregation, but really the dehumanization of black and brown bodies. And when we think about the Lost Cause, it justifies this through textbooks. William Archibald Dunning. John F. Kennedy learns about the Lost Cause history at Harvard University, right? And so instead of building monuments to Thaddeus Stevens, instead of building monuments to white and black and other abolitionists, we built monuments to white supremacists who were trying to commit, who did commit crimes against humanity, right? And so we're dealing with that unhappy pattern. What's interesting about Obama is a product of the second Reconstruction. Because during the second Reconstruction, and you've done such brilliant work on this, I look at that period as 1954 to 1968, the Brown Supreme Court decision, all the way up until the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on Thursday, April 4th, 1968. And in between, we've got Emmett Till, we have Rosa Parks and Dr. King, we've got Little Rock Central High School, 1957, we've got February 1st, 1960, and the sit-in movements in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is now a civil rights museum. We've got the freedom rides, and there's over 52 freedom rides between May and December of 1961, and I'm taking this from Ray's books. We've got James Meredith in Oxford, Mississippi in 1962, and there's 3 days of rioting at the prospect of one black student enrolling in Oxford, Mississippi. A couple of people die, right? In 1963, it's the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's also the year of Birmingham and James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. It's also the year where John Kennedy does his race speech, June 11th, 1963. Dr. King does his letter from Birmingham jail. It's also the year of the Walk for Freedom in Detroit, 125,000 people on June 23rd, 1963. And it's also the year, of course, of the March on Washington and the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. 64 is Freedom Summer. Charlene Hunter Bell was talking about Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney, and these are three of the martyrs who are assassinated on June 21st, 1964, Neshoba County, Philadelphia, Mississippi, just after 10 p.m., with police officers, sheriffs, and racial terrorists murdering three civil rights activists who are trying to bring small d democracy to Mississippi, right? And in we see the passage of the Civil Rights Act, July 2nd, 1964, and 65 is Selma, right? 65 is Bloody Sunday and Turnaround Tuesday. Lyndon Johnson gives the March 15th We Shall Overcome speech in 1965, and we get the Selma to Montgomery demonstration March 21st to the 25th of 65, and then the passage of the Voting Rights Act August 6, 1965, and then Watts. And really, when we think about 66, 67, 68, we see these urban rebellions, the rise of the Black Panthers, the move for community control, right? And so that heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement, what it does is provide Reconstructionists with a narrative victory that racial justice is a moral and political good. There's realpolitik to this too because of the Cold War, of course, right? There's all kinds of things going on. But the 63 to 2013 period, and I argue there's a 50-year racial justice period in the United States, from John F. Kennedy's June 11th, 1963 speech, all the way to the Supreme Court Shelby v. Holder decision, June 25th, 2013. And that 50-year period is imperfect, but here's why it's so important. During that 50-year period, you're going to have the most political and economic power and cultural power for Black people, people of color, and women in American history.
You can see it's a complicated historical roller coaster. Well, we won't have a quiz at the end, so but it's a fascinating period to write about and to read and to study. It's just nothing more extraordinary, I think. One thing that you do say in your book, I think, is that just to finish the thing about Barack Obama, that he was sort of a captive of his own optimism. In a sense, his story is, I think all of us, or most of us at least, in 2008 were so thrilled by his election. I can remember it was one of the happiest days of my life. And now, when things are so depressing, I look back and think, how come things were so happy then? And what happened, you know, in the last 14 years? But one of the things I thought was fascinating when you discussed Black Lives Matter was your stress of Black women. I wonder if you could talk about that for a moment. We just have a few minutes more. I want to throw it open to questions. But I thought that was one of the really striking things in your book about this emphasis on the leadership of Black women.
Oh, absolutely. I talk about Ida B. Wells. I talk about Angela Davis. I talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. I talk about Audre Lorde, Ruthie Gilmore, just a whole group of Black women, Tamika Mallory, Alicia Garza, through three different generations who've been pushing us towards abolition democracy. And I think that connects Stacey Abrams, so many others. I think it connects with just sort of putting a bow on the Obama discussion in BLM in this way. Black women are telling us a very specific story about American democracy. And it's very, very expansive, but it really connects and discusses both the bitter and beautiful parts of American history, right? And it's based on a deep love of America, but also with a really passionate critique of what's wrong in the country, both historically and contemporaneously. So in that sense, Obama's vision of American exceptionalism is constrained, right? What Black women try to teach us, I argue, as co-architects of this movement for Black citizenship and dignity, is that in order to have true citizenship and dignity for all people, we have to move beyond our current frameworks of American exceptionalism, where we're unwilling to talk about the bitter and the beautiful, right? Or we just ignore or elide what we've done wrong domestically and internationally. It doesn't mean that we're just going to tell a story that we've been 100% wrong, because we haven't been. But we can't tell a story that we've been 100% right, because we also haven't been, right? So I think the American people actually are much more sophisticated than that, and actually are stronger than that, where we can tell a story about the United States where we talk about both abolition democracy and those folks who fought for the 8-hour workday, those folks who fought for voting rights for all people, people who have fought for the right to love whoever you want, people who fought for, Frederick Douglass was against the 1892 Chinese Exclusion Act, for goodness sake, right? And one of the foremost feminists of the time. So by writing about Ida B. Wells, by writing about Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, by talking about Angela Davis, and I write about the essay Angela writes from prison in 1971 about black women and racial slavery and how she knits two periods of, really 3 generations of Reconstructionists together, I think it's crucial for us to have a larger story about American democracy that goes beyond just saying America is this great nation that has stumbled but always has picked itself back up where it stumbled, right? Oh, last word on this. In this sense, the vision that we saw from a movement for Black Lives in 2020 was a profoundly American tradition, but it was American vision, but it was in the Reconstructionist tradition. It was a multiracial vision of American democracy, and it's based on a profound patriotism. Dr. King talked about patriotism in his April 4th, 1967 speech at the Riverside Church in New York City. He says, I'm about to give a critique of America, not because I hate America, but because I profoundly love America. Right? And so when we think about patriotism, the true test of patriotism is, are we willing to critique the nation, but also then get together and do something about it? Get together to do something about it. So it's both with your words, but then your deeds, right? That's the true test of patriotism. So when I look at somebody like the women who are the architects of the movement for Black Lives Matter, what was so important to me was the fact that they were willing to courageously speak truth to power, even as they very much admired Barack Obama. Because one of the things I say is that Obama's rise in 07, 08 actually inspires a whole generation of people, including the movement for Black Lives. It does, even as they have a different interpretation of what American democracy is supposed to look like. And that's not unusual. In the 19th century, during Reconstruction, we had radical Reconstructionists like Frederick Douglass and Francis Harper and Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, but we also had mainstream Reconstructionists, right? We had even conservative Reconstructionists, but the radical Reconstructionists believed in black humanity, right? We called it social equality at the time. And yes, they believed that black people could be friends and neighbors and just part of the American family in ways that we're still having a hard time coming to terms with today.
You know, as Dr. King once said, he had to run faster and faster to keep up with the people who were following him, supposedly. And I think the same thing happened with President Obama trying to keep up with the Black Lives Matter activists. One final question, I'll throw it open to the audience. One of the good things that can happen to you when you write a book is that the New York Times will review it. And even more, they'll review it favorably. So Clay Reeson, who is a staff member at the Times, reviewed Peniel's book, I think very favorably. So I'm sure it's going to help the sales, and people are talking about it. But he had a sort of a caveat in that, and I think he was worried that the Black Lives Matter movement has not added up to as much as maybe you thought or hoped. You know, that in terms of functional change, that we put all these millions of people in the streets, but here we are in 2022, and what has really changed? I wonder if you had, what you thought when you read that part of his review.
Yeah, you know, I think what's interesting about BLM, and I think the book is about more than BLM, it's about these different movements of Reconstruction, but I think that without that movement, that insurgency from 2020, we wouldn't have had the first black woman vice president. We wouldn't have had the Biden-Harris administration. We wouldn't have had Warnock and Ossoff and been able to pass the bills from the last 2 years. And I really believe, even when we look at the outcome, the still yet to be determined outcome of the midterms, we're still seeing the way and the resonance of young people and the way in which young people are actually influencing our democracy. We've got Maxwell Frost right here in Florida. Folks want transformative, deep, and fundamental change. And it doesn't happen overnight, but certainly you've got to link the BLM movement to the Reconstructionist tendencies of the Biden-Harris administration. That's an imperfect administration, but certainly they are Reconstructionists. And one of the things I talk about with Biden is that Biden, who used to brag about authoring all the crime bills from the 1990s, he's really shifted, right? And so just because you're a redemptionist in one historical context doesn't mean that you can't be a Reconstructionist in another historical context, right? So I'd say that the last 2 years have been a testament to these Reconstructionist sensibilities, but there's always backlash. That's what people have to understand. I have a whole chapter called Backlash, right, in there. And there's always backlash. So there's always an effort, even after the Voting Rights Act, and even before 2013, there was backlash. After the Civil Rights Act, there's always going to be court cases and challenges that say, look what's happened with reproductive justice. Women in the United States had more reproductive justice during the Watergate hearings in 1974 than they do now, right? And so democracy is not linear. It's hard, right? And it's messy. And so those of us who believe in small d democracy, I say, you've got to think about the Black Lives Matter movement as something that helped jumpstart not just a political conversation, but also policy impact and implementation that we're seeing right now. There's always going to be a backlash.
That backlash chapter is very depressing, but it's very important that you read it. I can tell you. Well, I think that's a great answer, Peniel. I suspect that Clay Reeston was also in a kind of funk like a lot of us, thinking about, worrying about what this is all going to add up to. And so I think that's a very hopeful view that you gave, which I appreciate tremendously. Well, I'm sure some people have questions. We have 2 microphones. I can't see them, but I know they're there. So please come up and we have someone here.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, Peniel. Ça passe.
Ça passe.
Okay, so my name is Mickey, and I was born in Haiti, but grew up here. Just listening to that list of all the names in the past of people who have fought for us, I actually feel fatigued just sitting there listening to it. So I'm thinking now, when I hear the word reconstruction, to me it connotes fixing something that was already there. But I never experienced, equality living here in America.
Yeah.
So, as a Black woman, coming from Haiti, I was taught to be strong, I was taught to be resilient, I was taught to take it. We get really tired of doing that. So what does equality look like for you? I mean, what would that look like in America for us, immigrants, Black people? Because there's a lot of backlash recently. Like you said about women's rights, we're sliding backward, and I see a lot of poverty now because I work in my community, in my Haitian community, in my Black community, and it's very depressing. It's very hard. So I'm looking forward to reading your book, but it's like, so what does that look like in the future for equality? Thank you.
Oh, that's a great question. I think we're going to get to equality when we see that Black people and other people, including women and people of color, are not disproportionately overrepresented in negative social economic indicators and underrepresented in all the positive ones, like owning a home and having wealth and graduating from high school and college and attending elite places, having access to corporate boards and not just not-for-profit boards, being connected to financial institutions and being the recipients of venture capital and being connected to hedge funds and private equity. Also being not just elected officials at the municipal level, the state, the county, and the federal level, but also being part of the staff of those elected officials, right? And not just in Congress, but right here. It means not being underrepresented in the arts and television and music and culture, right? But also the supply chains that are connected to those things. So it really means the obliteration of racial and economic caste in this country, right? And I do believe we can actually do it. There's a great quote from James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, where he talks about Americans finally coming together to achieve their country at last, right? The whole 1776 and sort of the rhetoric of American democracy versus the reality of American democracy. I think for Black women specifically, that means being represented based on their demographics in positions of power and economic stability, but also having access to wealth and engines of wealth production to amplify the messages and to amplify their own creativity and their political, economic, cultural self-determination and empowerment. I think we've seen some of that. I think during the Third Reconstruction, one of the things I highlight is Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project and how impactful Nicole Hannah-Jones has been. Her Twitter handle is Ida Bay Wells, in homage to Ida B. Wells, the criminal justice reformer and data scientist and public intellectual who really, in the 1890s and the early 20th century, is the person who gives us all the red record and all the data on lynching that we have. So I do think, and in the earlier conversation there was the talk of reparations and whether we should talk about that or not. I do think we should talk about that. I think that I'm somebody who believes, just like what happened with the Holocaust, there were reparations paid. And I do believe that one of the reasons we've seen an uptick in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and queerphobia and violence against Asian American Pacific Islanders, violence against women, violence against Black women and Latinx women, indigenous women, is because of the resurgence of that lost cause narrative, right? Because it's a very, very hateful narrative, but what's interesting about the lost cause is it is bigger than white supremacy. White supremacy is a central tenet, but the reason why it's bigger than white supremacy, it tells a comforting tale that allows us to valorize Robert E. Lee, that allows us to valorize white supremacists who committed treason against the United States, allows us to build monuments to them. And if we build monuments to white supremacists, you remember Alexander Stevens says that the cornerstone of the Confederacy is slavery forever in perpetuity, right? John Calhoun says the same thing earlier, decades earlier, and he calls racial slavery a kind of a rough apprenticeship that God himself, because God is always a he, has bestowed on Black people to provide wealth for white folks. So the lost cause tells us this real comforting tale that allows us to reinterpret great acts of evil, right? Moral and political evil as acts of heroism, right? And so the reason why even the governor of this state doesn't want American history taught is he wants to continue through the K through 12 system that false history and false mythology that's really anti-American if you believe in Abraham Lincoln and just Reconstruction America, right? I mean, if you believe that we are a multiracial democracy, that slavery was one of the biggest moral and political evils ever perpetuated, and we're still confronting the reverberations of that, then you believe in a Reconstructionist vision of America. And I think the story we should be sharing with young people is that story of Reconstruction and abolition democracy, right? It should be a story where America is this expansive democracy that allows everyone who comes here to count, to have dignity and citizenship. Because either we all count, everybody counts, or none of us counts, right? And so when we think about Reconstruction is how we get there. right? Even though it's painful, because it's both the reconstruction of institutions, literally and figuratively, and the reconstruction of hearts and minds, but it's also a reconstruction of the national soul. That's why Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the tagline was to redeem the soul of America, right? So when we think about this idea of reconstruction, we're thinking about it in a multiple panoramic way.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, for coming to this session today. Wow, what a history lesson. I have to say that probably 90% of the people and the events that you talked about, students in K through 12 have no idea of who these people were, what they did, how we got where we are now. And that's really sad. You hit on two of the points I wanted to make real quickly. On reparations, that was one, yes, we did talk about it a little bit in the session before this one. Sandy Darity's book, From Here to Equality, where he actually lays out the formula, the mathematical formula in dollars and cents, and it's something like $13 trillion that he estimates today would be due to people of African descent. And he actually talks about how we can measure that, and if you can trace your lineage back so far, then you would qualify, and that it would be something like how we all pay income tax. Black people, white people, everybody would pay into this fund, but it would only go to descendants of African people. That's a whole other story. I really think that that is possible. I think it's doable. I may not live to see it, but I think it is a worthy goal. I don't think it's pie in the sky. The other thing real quick, you hit on this point too, the teaching of our history in Florida is severely threatened right now. And I know educators who are scared to death to go outside the Florida standards, even a little bit, with supplemental materials. My last comment is there is something being done about that in different areas. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, I'm sure you're familiar with the part of ASALH. I know you are, sir. We are coming to Florida next year. We'll be in Jacksonville, the annual conference and meeting, and we're trying to organize people all over the state, especially educators, to go to Jacksonville in September. If you go on the ASALH, A-S-A-L-H website, you'll see all of that information. And we really need to empower our educators and make them know that there are things that you can do to teach our history that do not go contrary to the Florida state standards. Your comments, please.
Authoritarianism and racial authoritarianism always masked itself in the language of freedom, right? And so during the Reconstruction period, the idea of black voting rights was so threatening that we got convict lease systems, we got sharecropping, peonage, but we also got outrageous racial pogroms against black people as early as 1866 in New Orleans and Memphis. But we also got, way before Trump's big lie, we've got the Reconstructionists and the Confederates' big lie that there was mounds of black voter fraud wherever blacks and whites got together in coalitions to get Republican rule, okay, in the 19th century, right? So this is old hat in new language, right? So the idea of the critical race theory hoax, the idea of saying we're going to stop you from doing this in the name of freedom. Those of you who are old enough to remember racial segregation and Jim Crow in America, that's what they said there too. They said segregation was going to make white people more free and black people more free too because we could stay with our own kind, right? That's what they told us, right? So this continues to be articulated in the 21st century, but what's really hopeful for us is that there's really a new generation that's here. And what I loved about the Black Lives Matter protesters was when they grabbed the mic, whether it was at a Bernie Sanders event or at a Hillary Clinton event. I'm a Generation Xer, I'm 50, right? I was a big critic of Bill Clinton's crime bill and welfare reform, but I used to speak, and I've always spoken out, black churches. I'm a child of the black church, New Bethel Baptist Church in New York as a Christian. And I used to say this, and people were upset. Black people were upset at me, right? Because they loved the Clintons because Bill Clinton played the trumpet on Arsenio Hall, right? Somehow sometimes we get easily fooled. Saxophone with a mess of pottage, we get easily fooled. But what these BLM folks did, both to Bill Clinton having a screaming match with him, right, and to Hillary with the super predator, was call people into account. And they're trying to call all of us into account, including baby boomers, including folks who, in one historical context, absolutely fought the good fight, but in another are really much more content to have access in this new Gilded Age where we have the largest economic inequality and disparity between the haves and have-nots in American history, right? So we're living that again. So I say that the hope for us is in telling a different story. I work with teachers in the Gilder Lehrman, and I try to work with so many K through 12 and high school teachers. Gilder Lehrman has 26,000 high school teachers, and these are folks who are committed to just telling the truth, the good, the bad, the ugly of the United States, right? So you can talk about America saving the world for democracy to your students, Second World War, and we did that, but we have to talk about Japanese internment camps too, and we have a segregated military. Our kids' heads are not going to explode when they find this out, right? They're not. That's the whole thing. And when you talk about, people say, well, if we teach slavery, the white kids are going to feel so bad. But there were white abolitionists too. There were white abolitionists too. Not all the white people were psyched about slavery. And we can talk about that. We can talk about it. So when you're whoever you are, whatever your background, you can be queer, Muslim, Jewish, disabled, black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, indigenous, wherever you're from, you are part of this American story, and there's an abolitionist element to that story. What Du Bois meant by abolition democracy was not just the abolishing of racial slavery, but he meant multiracial democracy, where instead of investing in systems of punishment and carceral systems and systems that divide and marginalize us, we would invest in systems that allow each and every one of us to flourish both individually and collectively. It's not either or. You can do you, like sometimes people say, I'm just doing me, right? But you've got to do we at the same time. It's not an either or.
We've run a couple minutes over, but I think it was worth it. And please join me in thanking Peniel.